The morning I woke up to find my bank account completely drained and my husband vanished without a trace, I sat staring at the empty apartment we'd shared for 2 years, surrounded by the remnants of what I thought was our perfect life. What Vincent didn't know as he disappeared with my life savings was that he hadn't just stolen from any ordinary woman, he'd stolen from the anonymous founder of the very fintech company that would soon make his life a living hell. Before we dive back in, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. And if this story resonates with you, don't forget to subscribe, because tomorrow's story is something truly special I can't wait to share. I remember that Tuesday morning with crystal clarity. The sunlight was streaming through the windows of our penthouse apartment in downtown Riverdale, painting everything in golden hues that should have felt warm and hopeful. Instead, they felt mocking. I'd reached for my phone to check my morning notifications, the same routine I'd followed for months, when I saw the first banking alert. Account balance, $47.23. My heart stopped. Yesterday, that account had held $847,000. My life savings. Every penny I'd earned, every bonus I'd received, every smart investment I'd made over the past 8 years. Gone. I called the bank immediately, my hands shaking as I dialed. The customer service representative, a woman named Janet with a sympathetic voice, delivered the devastating news with professional detachment. "Ma'am, I see multiple large withdrawals and transfers made yesterday evening between 11:47 p.m. and 2:33 a.m. All authorized with your joint account access and verified through the secondary authentication we have on file." Secondary authentication? I whispered, though I already knew. Vincent had access to everything. I'd given him my trust, my passwords, my complete financial transparency because I thought we were building a life together. We'd opened joint accounts 6 months ago when we got engaged. He'd insisted it would make wedding planning easier, that it showed how serious we were about our future together. The transfers went to 3 different offshore accounts, Janet continued. "I'm afraid once the money leaves our domestic banking system, there's very little we can do to recover it immediately. You'll need to file a police report," and I hung up. My hands were trembling so violently I could barely hold the phone. $847,000. Gone. And Vincent? Also gone. I walked through our apartment, my apartment. Though his name was on the lease too, calling his name even though I knew he wouldn't answer. His closet was empty except for the cheap suits he complained about, the ones he said made him look unprofessional compared to his colleagues. His expensive watch collection, the one I'd helped him build with gifts for birthdays and holidays, was gone. His laptop, his designer shoes, his cologne, everything that mattered to him had vanished, but he'd left behind something interesting. In his rush to disappear, Vincent had forgotten about the small trash can beside his desk. I found it there, a crumpled piece of paper with handwriting I recognized as his. It was a list, written in his careful script: Riverdale National, $340,000. Sunrise Credit Union, $287,000 investment portfolio, $220,000 flight, 6:15 a.m. to Nassau account. Hashtag 7739-8847-2234 Nassau. The Bahamas. Non-extradition country. He'd planned this down to the minute. I sank onto our couch, my couch, and tried to process what had happened. Vincent Carmichael, the man I'd been planning to marry in 3 months, had systematically stolen everything I owned and fled the country. The man who'd held me while I cried about work stress, who'd promised to support my dreams, who'd talked about the house we'd buy and the children we'd have. He'd been planning this robbery for months. The irony was almost laughable. Vincent had always been insecure about money, about his place in the world. He worked as a mid-level marketing coordinator At a small firm in Riverdale, making maybe $45,000 a year. He'd constantly complained about feeling inferior to my friends, about not being able to afford the lifestyle he thought he deserved. He'd made comments about my mysterious work, about how I could afford our expensive apartment and weekend trips to Aspen when I claimed to work as a freelance consultant. "You're so secretive about your work, Natalie," he'd said just last week over dinner at Meridian, the upscale restaurant where he proposed. "Sometimes I feel like I don't even know what you do all day." I'd laughed it off, told him consulting was boring, that I worked with small businesses on their digital strategies. It was technically true, just not the whole truth. I'd learned early in my career that being a 29-year-old woman who'd built a multi-million-dollar company from scratch made dating complicated. Men either wanted to use me or were intimidated by me. So I'd started downplaying my success, living modestly, keeping my wealth hidden. Vincent had met me at a coffee shop in Riverdale's Arts District, where I'd been working on my laptop like any other remote worker. He'd approached me with a cheesy line about my coffee order, and I'd found his nervousness endearing. He was handsome in an approachable way, not the polished, aggressive type who usually pursued me once they learned about my company. He seemed genuine, a little insecure maybe, but real. For 2 years, I'd maintained the illusion. I'd lived in a nice but not extravagant apartment, driven a reliable but modest car, dressed well but not ostentatiously. I'd paid for most of our dates and trips, but I'd done it subtly, in ways that didn't bruise his ego. When he'd proposed, I'd been genuinely happy. I thought I'd found someone who loved me for who I was, not what I could provide. Now, sitting in my empty apartment, I realized how naive I'd been. Vincent hadn't disappeared because he was overwhelmed by financial stress or because he'd gotten cold feet about marriage. He'd disappeared because he'd successfully executed a plan to steal everything he thought I was worth. What Vincent didn't know, what he couldn't possibly know, was that the $847,000 he'd stolen wasn't my fortune. It was my checking account. My play money. My day-to-day expenses fund. My real wealth was tied up in something much more powerful than bank accounts. Something that would make his new life in Nassau very, very complicated. I picked up my phone and dialed a number I hadn't called in months. "Hello, this is Natalie Rivera," I said when the familiar voice answered. "I need to schedule an emergency board meeting. We have a problem that requires immediate attention." It was time to stop hiding who I really was. It took a lot of care and time to prepare and narrate this for you, so if you're enjoying it, a quick subscribe really helps and means the world to us. Alright, let's get back to it. 2 years earlier, I had been sitting in that same coffee shop in Riverdale's Arts District, exhausted from back-to-back investor meetings and desperately needing a place to decompress. At 27, I was already running the fastest-growing fintech startup in the Pacific Northwest, but the weight of that success was crushing me. Every conversation was transactional. Every date ended with someone asking for investment advice or business connections. Every friendship felt conditional on what I could provide. That's why I'd started my normal person routine. I'd found this little coffee shop called Brewstone Cafe, tucked between a vintage bookstore and a yoga studio, where nobody knew me as anything other than the quiet woman who ordered the same lavender latte every Tuesday and Thursday. I'd dress down in jeans and oversized sweaters, work on my laptop like any other remote employee, and pretend for a few hours that I wasn't responsible for a company valued at $47 million. Vincent appeared on a rainy Thursday in October, sliding into the chair across from me with a nervous smile and a terrible pickup line. "Excuse me," he'd said, his voice slightly shaky, "but I've been coming here for weeks trying to work up the courage to ask, what's in that drink? It smells incredible, and I'm tired of ordering the same boring coffee every day." I looked up from my laptop, where I'd been reviewing quarterly projections for Payflow Solutions, the company I'd built from nothing in my tiny studio apartment 4 years earlier. Vincent was handsome in an understated way. Dark hair that looked like he'd run his fingers through it, kind brown eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, a smile that seemed genuine rather than practiced. He was wearing a slightly wrinkled button-down shirt and a tie that had seen better days. "Lavender latte with oat milk," I said, closing my laptop. "But fair warning, it's basically dessert in a cup." "I like dessert," he replied, and something about the way he said it made me smile for the first time in weeks. That conversation stretched into 2 hours. Vincent told me he worked in marketing for a small advertising firm called Creative Dynamics, that he'd moved to Riverdale 6 months earlier from Portland for the job, that he was still trying to figure out the city and make friends. He was refreshingly normal. He didn't name drop, didn't try to impress me with connections or accomplishments, didn't even ask what I did for work until 40 minutes into our conversation. "I'm a consultant," I'd said when he finally asked, using the rehearsed line I'd perfected. "I help small businesses optimize their digital payment systems." It was technically true. Payflow Solutions did work with businesses to streamline their payment processing. I just neglected to mention that we served over 200,000 clients across North America, that we'd processed $2.8 billion in transactions the previous year, or that I was the CEO who'd built the entire platform from scratch. "That sounds fascinating," Vincent had said, and the amazing thing was, he seemed to mean it. "I work with a lot of small businesses through the agency. They're always struggling with payment stuff. Maybe we could grab dinner sometime and you could tell me more about what you do?" I said yes because for the first time in months, someone was asking me out without knowing my net worth. Our first official date was at a mid-range Italian restaurant called Bella Vista, the kind of place where entrees cost $25 and the wine list fit on a single page. Vincent had chosen it carefully, I could tell, somewhere nice enough to impress but not so expensive that it would strain his budget. He'd arrived 10 minutes early, clearly nervous, wearing a navy blazer that was slightly too big for his frame. "I have to confess something," he'd said over appetizers. "I looked up your consulting business online, but I couldn't find much information about it." My heart had skipped a beat. Payflow Solutions had a deliberately minimal online presence. We served enterprise clients who found us through referrals, not through flashy websites. But if Vincent had dug deeper, if he'd found the business journals that had featured me, the tech conferences where I'd been a keynote speaker, "I keep a pretty low profile," I'd said carefully. "Most of my clients prefer discretion." Small business owners can be sensitive about admitting they need help with financial systems. Vincent had nodded, seeming to accept this explanation. "That makes sense. I work with a lot of family-owned businesses, and they're the same way about marketing. They want results, but they don't want everyone knowing they hired outside help." The relief I felt was intoxicating. He wasn't probing because he suspected I was hiding wealth, he was just making conversation. For the first time in years, I was on a date with someone who wasn't trying to figure out how to profit from knowing me. Our relationship developed slowly, naturally. Vincent was attentive without being overwhelming, ambitious without being ruthless. He had dreams of starting his own marketing firm someday, of building something meaningful, but he wasn't in a rush. He seemed content with his life in a way that I envied. "You know what I love about you, Natalie?" he'd said one evening about 3 months into our relationship. We were walking along the Riverdale waterfront after dinner, the city lights reflecting on the dark water. "You're so grounded. Everyone in this city is always hustling, always trying to be the next big thing. But you seem genuinely happy just doing good work and living your life. If only he knew. At that very moment, I had 6 missed calls from my CFO about a potential acquisition deal worth $30 million. But in Vincent's eyes, I was just Natalie Rivera, the quiet consultant who lived modestly and was genuinely interested in his stories about difficult clients and office politics. I started living a double life. During the day, I'd run board meetings and negotiate contracts and make decisions that affected hundreds of thousands of users. At night and on weekends, I'd transform into Vincent's girlfriend, the woman who split grocery bills and suggested staying in to watch Netflix instead of going to expensive restaurants. The deception became easier with practice. When Vincent complained about his salary or worried about making rent, I'd offer sympathy rather than solutions. When he mentioned wanting to take a vacation but not being able to afford it, I'd suggest camping trips instead of the European getaways I could have easily funded. I became an expert at hiding my wealth while making him feel like the provider in our relationship. "I love taking care of you," he'd said one evening as he insisted on paying for our dinner at a chain restaurant. The bill was $37. And I knew he'd been saving for weeks to afford even that small gesture. But the pride in his voice, the way he smiled as he handed over his credit card, I didn't want to take that away from him. So I let him take care of me. I let him believe he was the successful one, the one with his life together, the one who could provide stability and security. I told myself it was romantic, that I was protecting what we had from the complications that money always brought to my relationships. I should have realized that a man's pride could be just as dangerous as his greed. What Vincent never knew was that while he was struggling to afford dinner at chain restaurants, I was building an empire that would revolutionize how money moved through the digital world. Payflow Solutions wasn't just another fintech startup. It was the invisible backbone powering thousands of businesses across 3 continents, processing billions of dollars in transactions every single day. The company had started 4 years earlier in my cramped studio apartment in Millbrook Heights, born from pure frustration. I'd been working as a junior developer at a traditional payment processing company called DataStream Financial, watching as they charged outrageous fees to small businesses while providing clunky, outdated technology that crashed during peak traffic. Every day, I saw mom-and-pop shops losing money because the payment systems were designed to benefit large corporations, not the entrepreneurs who needed them most. One particularly brutal Friday, I'd watched a small bakery owner named Elena Rodriguez break down in tears during a client call. Her payment system had crashed during the morning rush, causing her to lose an entire day's worth of sales during what should have been her busiest period of the week. The technical support team had put her on hold for 2 hours, then told her the earliest they could send a technician was the following Tuesday. "I can't afford to lose 4 days of sales," Elena had sobbed into the phone. "This is my family's livelihood. My daughter needs surgery next month, and every transaction matters." That night, I went home and started coding. Not tweaking DataStream's existing system, not proposing improvements to my supervisor, actually building something entirely new. I worked 18-hour days for 3 months, living on coffee and determination, creating a payment processing platform that was faster, more reliable, and infinitely more affordable than anything on the market. The breakthrough came when I developed a proprietary algorithm that could predict and prevent system failures before they happened. Instead of waiting for crashes and then fixing them, my system identified potential problems and rerouted traffic automatically, ensuring that businesses never lost a single transaction. It was revolutionary, and I knew it. I quit my job at DataStream on a Monday morning, incorporated Payflow Solutions that afternoon, and launched with Elena Rodriguez as my first client. Within 6 months, I had 50 businesses using the platform. Within a year, I had 5,000. By year 2, We'd processed our first $1 billion in transactions, and venture capitalists were calling me daily. The growth was meteoric and terrifying. I'd never intended to build a massive company. I just wanted to solve a problem that kept me awake at night. But suddenly I was managing a team of 40 employees, fielding acquisition offers from tech giants, and watching my bank account grow by millions every quarter. The media attention that followed was overwhelming. Forbes featured me on their 30 Under 30 list. TechCrunch called Payflow Solutions the most disruptive fintech innovation since mobile banking. Harvard Business School invited me to speak about entrepreneurship and scaling technology companies. Suddenly, everyone wanted to know about Natalie Rivera, the young woman who'd built a payment processing empire from nothing. That's when I made the decision that would shape the next 3 years of my life. I hired the best PR firm in Seattle and paid them a small fortune to make me disappear from public view. We scrubbed my personal information from company websites, declined all interview requests, and created a carefully crafted narrative that Payflow Solutions was run by a team of experienced fintech professionals rather than a single founder. My CFO, Derek Williamson, became the public face of the company. He was 15 years older than me, had an MBA from Wharton, and looked exactly like what investors expected a fintech CEO to be: middle-aged, male, and completely unremarkable. Meanwhile, I operated from the shadows, making all the major decisions. While maintaining complete anonymity, the strategy worked perfectly. Payflow Solutions continued to grow exponentially, but Natalie Rivera remained invisible. I could walk through downtown Riverdale without being recognized, attend industry conferences as Derek's technical advisor, and live a relatively normal life outside the office. By the time I met Vincent, Payflow Solutions was processing $2.8 billion annually and valued at $47 million. We had offices in 6 cities, partnerships with major banks, and a client list that read like a directory of America's most successful small businesses. I personally owned 67% of the company, with the remaining shares split between early employees and a carefully selected group of silent investors. My personal wealth had grown accordingly. Beyond the checking account that Vincent would eventually drain, I had investment portfolios worth $12 million, real estate holdings in 4 states valued at $8 million, and equity in Payflow Solutions that increased in value every quarter. My accountant had recently informed me that my net worth had crossed the $30 million threshold, making me one of the wealthiest self-made women under 30 in the Pacific Northwest. But wealth brought isolation. Every relationship became complicated by questions of motive. Did people want to be around me because they genuinely enjoyed my company, or because they sensed opportunity? Were potential romantic partners interested in Natalie the person, or Natalie the bank account? The paranoia had consumed my previous relationship. Marcus Hendricks, an investment banker I'd dated for 8 months, had discovered my true identity 3 weeks before I'd planned to tell him myself. I'd come home from a board meeting to find him in my home office, reading through confidential company documents. "You've been lying to me for 8 months," he'd said, not even looking ashamed about violating my privacy. "Do you have any idea what this company is worth? What you're worth?" The relationship ended that night, but not before Marcus had tried to convince me to invest in his firm, introduce him to my venture capital contacts, and consider a merger between our companies. The man I thought loved me had immediately started calculating how to monetize our relationship. That experience taught me that my wealth wasn't just an asset, it was a weapon that could destroy any chance of authentic connection. So when I met Vincent, I'd been more careful than ever to hide every trace of my success. I'd deliberately chosen the modest apartment in Riverdale instead of the penthouse I could afford. I'd bought a reliable Honda Civic instead of the Tesla that sat in my private garage across town. I'd created an entirely separate life that bore no resemblance to the boardrooms and business deals that filled my days. The irony was devastating. While Vincent was planning to steal what he thought was my life savings, the real fortune was sitting in accounts he didn't even know existed. The $847,000 he'd taken represented less than 3% of my liquid assets, and a fraction of my overall wealth, but Vincent had stolen something far more valuable than money. He'd stolen my faith in my own judgment, my belief that someone could love me without an agenda, my hope that I could build a relationship based on truth rather than deception. What he hadn't stolen, what he couldn't possibly comprehend, was my power to destroy him. The 18 months leading up to our engagement were the happiest I'd ever been, or at least I thought they were. Vincent had settled into our relationship with a contentment that felt genuine, and I'd convinced myself that my elaborate deception was actually protecting something pure and beautiful. Every morning felt like a small miracle, waking up next to someone who loved me for reasons that had nothing to do with my bank account or business connections. Vincent's affection seemed so authentic. He'd bring me coffee in bed on Saturday mornings, not expensive artisanal beans from boutique roasters, but simple dark roast from the grocery store that he'd learned to make exactly how I liked it, strong with just a splash of cream. He'd leave little notes in my purse before business trips, sweet messages like "have a great consulting day," that made me smile even during tense board meetings where millions of dollars hung in the balance. Our routine became sacred to me. Tuesday evenings were reserved for cooking together in my modest kitchen, where Vincent would attempt increasingly ambitious recipes while I chopped vegetables and pretended my biggest concern was whether the pasta sauce needed more oregano. Weekends meant hiking trails in the Cascade foothills, where Vincent would pack carefully budgeted picnic lunches and I'd marvel at how peaceful it felt to walk through forests without checking my phone every 5 minutes for urgent emails from Derek or emergency calls from our development team. "You know what I love about us?" Vincent had said one Sunday afternoon as we sat beside Clearwater Lake, sharing sandwiches he'd made with ingredients carefully selected for their value at the discount grocery store. "We don't need expensive things to be happy. We don't need to impress anyone or keep up with some impossible lifestyle. We just need each other." I'd leaned against his shoulder, watching families play in the water, and felt something I'd never experienced before: complete peace. For those few hours, I wasn't the CEO of Payflow Solutions. I wasn't responsible for protecting the financial data of hundreds of thousands of small businesses. I wasn't the woman who'd been featured on the cover of Entrepreneur magazine 3 years earlier, back when I still allowed public recognition. I was just Natalie, Vincent's girlfriend, sharing a perfectly ordinary moment that felt extraordinary because it was ours. The proposal came on a crisp November evening, exactly 14 months after our first coffee shop conversation. Vincent had planned everything meticulously, though I could see the careful budgeting behind every detail. He'd chosen Riverside Park at sunset, where the city lights were just beginning to twinkle across the water but admission was free. He'd bought a ring from a small jeweler in Riverdale's historic district, not the designer stores where I could have afforded anything, but a family-owned shop where he'd clearly spent months saving for a modest but beautiful solitaire diamond. "Natalie Rivera," he'd said, dropping to one knee beside the same bench where we'd had our first real conversation about our futures, "you've made me believe in building something real, something lasting. You've shown me that the best things in life aren't about money or status, they're about finding someone who makes you want to be better every single day." My throat had closed with emotion. In that moment, watching Vincent's nervous hands shake slightly as he opened the ring box, I'd felt like the luckiest woman alive. Here was a man who was proposing not because I could fund his dreams or elevate his social status, but because he genuinely wanted to build a life with the woman he thought I was. "Will you marry me?" he'd whispered, and his voice cracked slightly on the last word. "Yes," I'd said, and I'd meant it with every fiber of my being. The celebration dinner that followed was perfect in its simplicity. Vincent had made reservations. At Meridian, the upscale restaurant where we'd celebrated our 6-month anniversary, but I could see him calculating costs as he ordered. He chose the second least expensive bottle of wine on the menu, skipped the appetizer he clearly wanted, and insisted we share dessert because he was too full, though I suspected it was because he was already worried about the bill. To us, he'd said, raising his glass of wine that had cost him probably 2 days' worth of lunch money, and to building something beautiful together. We'd spent the following months planning a wedding that reflected Vincent's financial reality rather than my hidden wealth. He insisted on paying for half of everything, which meant scaling back our dreams to match his income. Instead of the luxury venue I could have easily afforded, we chose a community center with basic catering. Instead of designer flowers, we opted for seasonal arrangements from a local grocery store's floral department. Instead of a honeymoon in Europe, Vincent had suggested a long weekend at a bed and breakfast 3 hours north of Riverdale. I'd embraced every compromise because I thought it proved our love was real. When Vincent stressed about the costs, I'd quietly supplement his contributions without him knowing, paying vendors the difference between what we'd budgeted and what everything actually cost. I told myself I was protecting his pride while investing in our future happiness. The wedding itself, held on a Saturday in May at the Riverdale Community Arts Center, was everything I'd never known I wanted. Intimate, authentic, filled with the people who mattered most to both of us. Vincent's parents had driven up from Sacramento, bringing his grandmother, who insisted on giving me her own grandmother's pearl bracelet as a wedding gift. My mother had cried through the entire ceremony, whispering to anyone who'd listen how proud she was that I'd found someone who loved me for exactly who I was. Vincent's wedding vows had been so heartfelt they'd left half the guests in tears. Natalie, you've taught me that wealth isn't measured in dollars, it's measured in moments like these. In the way you make me laugh when I've had the worst day, and how you believe in my dreams even when I'm not sure I believe in them myself. I promise to spend every day proving I'm worthy of the gift of loving you. The reception had been magical despite its modest budget. Vincent had surprised me by hiring a DJ instead of the playlist we discussed, though I later learned he'd used his entire savings to afford the upgrade. We danced to It Last by Etta James while our friends and family watched from tables decorated with flowers that Vincent had personally picked up from 3 different shops to get the best possible prices. That night, in the honeymoon suite at the Riverside Inn that Vincent had booked as a splurge, probably the most expensive single purchase he'd ever made, I'd felt like I was living in a fairy tale. Vincent had been so tender, so grateful, so completely present in a way that made me forget about board meetings and profit margins and the weight of running a company that employed 47 people. Mrs. Carmichael, he'd whispered as we lay tangled in sheets that probably cost less than my usual dry cleaning bill, I can't believe you're actually mine. Forever, I'd whispered back, and in that moment, I'd believed it completely. We'd honeymooned at Cedar Ridge Lodge, a rustic retreat in the mountains where Vincent had proudly paid for everything himself, the cabin rental, the mediocre restaurant meals, even the couple's massage at the lodge's small spa. I'd watched him calculate tips and study menus and choose activities based on their cost rather than his preferences, and I'd fallen even deeper in love with his determination to provide for me within his means. During those 3 days, I'd made a decision that felt momentous at the time. I was going to tell Vincent the truth about Payflow Solutions, about my wealth, about who I really was. Not immediately, I wanted to give us a few months to settle into married life first, but soon. I'd imagined his shock, his questions, maybe even his anger at being deceived. But I'd also imagined his eventual understanding, his pride in what I'd built, his excitement about the possibilities our combined future could hold. That I'd pictured us moving into the penthouse I'd been secretly keeping, traveling to places Vincent had only dreamed about, maybe even working together to expand Payflow Solutions into new markets. I'd imagined finally being able to be completely myself with the person I loved most. What I hadn't imagined was that Vincent was already planning to disappear with everything he thought I was worth. The change in Vincent began so subtly that I almost missed it entirely. It started 3 weeks after we returned from our honeymoon, with small shifts in behavior that I initially attributed to post-wedding adjustment stress. The man who had spent 18 months being attentive and affectionate began creating distance in ways that felt deliberate but were difficult to pinpoint. Our morning coffee ritual was the first casualty. For over a year, Vincent had made it a point to bring me coffee in bed every Saturday and Sunday, using those quiet moments to talk about our week, share silly stories, or simply enjoy each other's company in comfortable silence. Suddenly, he was sleeping until 10, claiming he was exhausted from work, leaving me to make my own coffee while he stayed buried under the covers checking his phone. "Everything okay at Creative Dynamics?" I'd asked one Saturday morning, sitting on the edge of our bed with my own hastily made coffee, watching him scroll through what appeared to be financial websites rather than work emails. "Just busy," he'd muttered without looking up. "Peterson's pushing some big campaign for a new client. Lots of late nights coming up." But when I'd called his office the following Tuesday to see if he wanted to grab lunch, his colleague Amanda had mentioned that things had been unusually quiet lately. That several projects had been postponed, and that most of the team had been leaving early all week. Vincent hadn't mentioned any of this when he'd come home at his usual time, hadn't suggested we take advantage of his lighter workload to spend more time together. The affectionate gestures disappeared next. Vincent had always been physically demonstrative, holding my hand while we watched television, kissing my forehead when he passed behind my chair, reaching for me unconsciously while we slept. These small intimacies had been one of the things I treasured most about our relationship, proof that his love was instinctive rather than calculated. Now he sat on the opposite end of the couch during our evening shows, claimed he was too warm to cuddle, and began staying up late in the living room after I'd gone to bed. When I asked if he was coming to bed, he'd say he wanted to finish watching something or that he had work to catch up on, but I could hear him moving around restlessly for hours, never actually settling down to sleep. "Are you avoiding me?" I'd asked directly one evening, about 6 weeks into this new pattern. We were supposed to be watching a movie together, but Vincent had spent the entire time on his laptop, occasionally glancing at the screen with apparent disinterest. "Don't be ridiculous," he'd said, but he'd closed the laptop with a sharp snap that suggested irritation rather than reassurance. "I'm just dealing with some stress right now. Work stuff. Nothing you need to worry about." But I was worried, especially when Vincent's work stuff began involving increasingly secretive phone calls that he'd take in other rooms, speaking in hushed tones that stopped abruptly whenever I appeared. He'd started password protecting his laptop, something he'd never done during our entire relationship. He'd begun making excuses to leave the apartment for hours at a time, grocery runs that took 3 hours. Gym sessions that lasted all afternoon, mysterious errands that he described vaguely as running around town. The financial conversations were what truly alarmed me. Vincent had always been transparent about money, sharing his concerns about expenses and including me in decisions about our modest household budget. Suddenly, he was asking detailed questions about my consulting work that felt more like interrogation than casual interest. "How exactly does your payment processing consulting work?" he'd asked one evening over dinner at Romano's, the mid-range Italian restaurant that had become our regular date night spot. "Like, do you charge by the hour, or do you get a percentage of what you save companies?" "It depends on the project," I'd answered carefully, using the same vague responses I'd perfected over the past 2 years. "Some clients prefer hourly rates, others want flat project fees." "But what's your typical project worth? Ballpark?" The Question felt loaded in a way that made my stomach tighten. It varies a lot. Small businesses might pay a few thousand for basic optimization. Larger companies might invest more for comprehensive system overhauls. A few thousand, Vincent had repeated, and I'd caught something calculating in his expression before he'd smiled and changed the subject to weekend plans. The weekend plans themselves had become another source of tension. Vincent, who had previously been content with hiking, picnics, and other low-cost activities, began pushing for more expensive entertainment. He'd suggest dinner at restaurants well beyond his usual budget, propose weekend trips to luxury resorts. We'd never discussed, and become irritated when I'd counter with our typical modest alternatives. "Don't you ever want to do something special?" he'd asked after I'd suggested making dinner at home instead of going to the new steakhouse downtown that charged $45 for entrees. "We're married now. Shouldn't we be celebrating that? Enjoying life a little?" "We do enjoy life," I'd replied, confused by the sudden shift in his priorities. "We've always had fun together without spending a lot of money." "That's not what I mean," he'd said, and there had been an edge to his voice that I'd never heard before. "I mean really enjoying life. Like people our age with actual careers and futures." The comment had stung because it suggested that Vincent saw our current lifestyle, the lifestyle he'd claimed to love, as somehow inadequate or temporary. It made me wonder if his previous contentment had been an act, if he'd been secretly frustrated with our modest means while telling me how much he valued our simple pleasures. His attitude toward my work became increasingly dismissive. Vincent had always shown interest in my consulting projects, asking thoughtful questions about the challenges small businesses faced and celebrating my successes with genuine enthusiasm. Now he'd roll his eyes when I mentioned difficult clients, make sarcastic comments about fixing other people's problems, and suggest that maybe I should focus on finding real opportunities instead of helping mom-and-pop shops count pennies. "Maybe you should think bigger," he'd said one evening when I'd mentioned landing a new client. "There's got to be more money in corporate consulting than whatever you're doing with these small-time operations." "I like helping small businesses," I'd replied honestly. "They're the ones who really need support with payment processing issues." "Sure, but wouldn't you rather make real money? Build something that actually matters?" The irony of that statement was almost unbearable. Vincent was criticizing me for not building something significant while completely unaware that I'd already built something worth $47 million. But his dismissive tone made it clear that he'd decided my work was beneath his newfound ambitions. The breaking point came during a dinner with Vincent's colleagues from Creative Dynamics. Amanda Morrison, who'd been friendly during previous group gatherings, had mentioned that her husband was launching a tech startup and looking for investors. "You should talk to Vincent about it," she'd said to me over appetizers at Cascade Brewing. "He's been asking everyone about investment opportunities lately. Seems like he's got some capital he's looking to put to work." I'd looked at Vincent in confusion. As far as I knew, he had maybe $3,000 in his savings account and was still paying off student loans. When had he developed interest in investment opportunities, and where did he think he'd get capital to invest? "Just exploring options," Vincent had said quickly, shooting Amanda a look that seemed designed to shut down the conversation. "Nothing concrete yet. But the damage was done." I'd spent the rest of the evening watching my husband with new eyes, noticing how he'd steered conversations toward financial topics, how he'd asked probing questions about Amanda's husband's business plans, how he'd seemed to be gathering information rather than simply socializing. That night, I'd lain awake staring at the ceiling while Vincent slept soundly beside me, and for the first time since we'd met, I'd wondered if I really knew the man I'd married. The Vincent who was asking about investment capital didn't match the Vincent who'd carefully budgeted for our wedding flowers. The Vincent who was dismissive of small businesses didn't align with the Vincent who had once told me how much he admired entrepreneurs. Something fundamental had shifted in our relationship, and I couldn't shake the feeling that Vincent was planning something I wasn't going to like. The final week of our marriage felt like watching a slow-motion car crash that I was powerless to prevent. Vincent's behavior had escalated from distant to deliberately cruel, and I found myself walking on eggshells in my own home, trying to understand what had triggered such a dramatic transformation in the man I'd thought I knew completely. Monday morning started with Vincent announcing he needed to take a few personal days from work to handle some important business. He was evasive about the details, claiming it involved helping a friend with a family emergency, but something about his tone suggested the explanation was rehearsed. He spent most of the day making phone calls in our bedroom with the door closed, emerging only to grab snacks and avoid eye contact. "Is everything okay with your friend?" I'd asked that evening over a dinner he'd barely touched. "It's complicated," Vincent had replied curtly. "Nothing you need to worry about." The dismissive response had stung more than I'd expected. For 2 years, we'd shared everything: work stress, family drama, financial concerns, silly everyday observations. The sudden exclusion from his thoughts felt like emotional whiplash. Tuesday brought more secretive behavior. Vincent left the apartment early, claiming he needed to run errands, but returned home with nothing to show for his day out. His clothes smelled like cigarettes, though he'd quit smoking a year earlier, and he was carrying a manila folder that he quickly stuffed into his desk drawer when he thought I wasn't looking. "How were your errands?" I'd asked, genuinely trying to maintain some semblance of normal conversation. "Fine," he'd snapped, then seemed to catch himself. "Sorry. Just tired. It's been a long day." But he wasn't tired. He was wired, restless, checking his phone constantly and pacing around the apartment like he was waiting for something important to happen. When I'd suggested we order pizza and watch a movie together, he claimed he wasn't hungry and disappeared into the bedroom. Again, Wednesday was when I started finding the evidence. While Vincent was in the shower, his phone had buzzed with a text message that lit up the screen. I hadn't intended to spy, but the preview was visible: transfer confirmed. Account ready for tomorrow. My blood had gone cold. Transfer? What transfer? Vincent had never mentioned anything about moving money or changing banks. In fact, he'd always claimed to barely have enough in his checking account to cover monthly expenses. That afternoon, while Vincent was mysteriously absent again, I'd done something I'd never thought I'd do. I'd looked through his desk drawer. The manila folder contained photocopies of documents that made my heart stop: our joint bank account statements, highlighted sections showing deposit patterns and account balances, and most chillingly, printed pages from travel websites showing flights to Nassau departing Thursday morning, the Bahamas, non-extradition territory, and flights leaving less than 24 hours from now. I'd sat in our living room, staring at the evidence, trying to process what I was seeing. Vincent wasn't having a rough patch at work or dealing with a friend's emergency. He was planning something that involved our joint finances and a quick escape to a country where American law enforcement couldn't touch him. The pieces began falling into place with horrifying clarity. His recent questions about my income, his interest in our account balances, his sudden desire for expensive lifestyle changes. He'd been calculating. Not planning our future together, but planning his future without me, funded by whatever he could steal from what he thought was my modest savings. Thursday morning arrived with Vincent acting almost normal for the first time in weeks. He'd made coffee, kissed my forehead, and chatted casually about his plans for the day as if he hadn't spent the previous week treating me like a stranger. "I need to handle some paperwork this morning," he'd said over breakfast, his tone light and conversational. Boring financial stuff. Should be back by afternoon. I'd nodded and smiled, playing along with his charade while my mind raced. The flight information I'd found showed a departure time of 6:15 a.m. If Vincent was planning to leave on that flight, he would have already gone to the airport. Unless there was a later flight, or unless his plans had changed. At 10:30 a.m., I'd received a text from Vincent, running late with errands. Don't wait up for lunch. At 11:47 a.m., my phone had started buzzing with banking alerts. The first notification showed a withdrawal of $50,000 from our primary joint checking account. The second showed a transfer of $180,000 from our joint savings. The third showed another withdrawal of $75,000. They kept coming, one after another, until my phone was vibrating constantly with alerts about money disappearing from accounts that Vincent had legitimate access to as my husband. I'd called him immediately, but his phone went straight to voicemail. I'd tried again. Voicemail. Again. Voicemail. By noon, I was sitting on our couch, watching in real time as our joint accounts were systematically drained. Vincent had taken everything, not just the checking and savings accounts, but the emergency fund we'd built together, the money I'd been saving for a down payment on a house. Even the small investment account where I'd been putting aside funds for our future children's education. The final transfer had gone through at 2:33 p.m., leaving exactly $47.23 in our primary checking account. $47.23. Not even enough to cover our monthly Netflix subscription. I'd called the bank in a panic, reaching the same customer service representative, Janet, who delivered the devastating news with professional sympathy. All the transactions had been properly authorized using Vincent's legitimate account access and the secondary authentication we'd established when we'd opened the joint accounts. From the bank's perspective, there was nothing unusual about a husband moving money from joint accounts he was legally entitled to access. The transfers went to 3 different accounts, Janet had explained. 2 domestic transfers to accounts we're not able to identify, and 1 international wire transfer to a bank in Nassau. Just like the flight information I'd found, the apartment felt different when I'd hung up the phone. Not just empty, but violated. Vincent hadn't just taken our money, he'd taken our entire shared life and reduced it to a series of calculated transactions. Every joint decision we'd made about finances, every conversation about our future, every moment when I'd thought we were building something together had been part of his long-term plan to rob me. I'd walked through our home, my home now, I supposed, looking for other signs of his departure. His good clothes were gone, but he'd left behind the cheap suits he'd always complained about. His expensive watch collection, the one I'd helped him build with birthday and anniversary gifts, had vanished, but he'd left his old digital watch on the nightstand. His laptop was gone, but he'd left his old tablet. He'd taken only the things that had value, leaving behind anything that connected him to the modest lifestyle he pretended to embrace. In our bathroom, I'd found the most insulting detail of all. Vincent had left behind a travel-sized bottle of the cologne I'd bought him for our first anniversary, the one he'd claimed was his favorite scent. Apparently, it wasn't worth the luggage space. The note I found tucked under his pillow was brief and devastating. Natalie, I need some time to figure things out. Don't try to contact me. The money will help me get back on my feet and start fresh. You'll be fine. You always are. V. Not love, Vincent or your husband or even sorry. Just V, as if our 2-year relationship and 4-month marriage could be reduced to a single initial. I'd sat on our bed, holding that note, and felt something break inside me that had nothing to do with money. Vincent had stolen my savings, yes, but more than that, he'd stolen my faith in my own judgment. He'd made me question every moment of happiness we'd shared, every gesture of love he'd offered, every future plan we'd made together, for 2 years. I'd hidden my wealth because I'd wanted to be loved for who I was rather than what I could provide. Instead, I'd been systematically deceived by someone who'd spent months calculating how to steal what little he thought I had. The cruelest irony was that Vincent had destroyed our marriage and committed multiple felonies to steal less than 3% of my actual wealth. If he'd simply asked, if he'd been honest about financial stress or ambitions, I could have helped him in ways that would have transformed both our lives. Instead, he'd chosen deception and theft, not knowing that he was robbing someone who could have given him everything he'd ever dreamed of. As I sat in my empty apartment, holding his dismissive note and staring at bank statements showing zero balances, I realized that Vincent's biggest mistake wasn't underestimating my wealth. His biggest mistake was underestimating me. The transformation from devastated wife to strategic investigator happened faster than I'd expected. By Thursday evening, less than 6 hours after discovering Vincent's betrayal, I was sitting in my home office with 3 laptops open, 2 phones charging, and a legal pad covered in notes that would have impressed any FBI financial crimes unit. The first call I made wasn't to the police or a lawyer, it was to Derek Williamson, my CFO at Payflow Solutions. Derek, it's Natalie. I need you to activate Protocol 7 immediately. Protocol 7 was our internal code for financial fraud investigation, a comprehensive system we developed to help our clients trace stolen funds and identify theft patterns. I'd never imagined I'd need to use it for personal reasons, but Payflow Solutions had some of the most sophisticated financial tracking technology in the world, and Vincent had just made the mistake of stealing from someone who literally built systems to catch financial criminals. What's the situation? Derek's voice was instantly alert. He'd worked with me long enough to know I didn't activate emergency protocols lightly. Personal matter. My husband just stole $847,000 from our joint accounts and fled to Nassau. I need a complete forensic analysis of all transactions, account origins for the transfers, and a full background investigation on Vincent Carmichael, Social Security number 547-88-9234. The silence on Derek's end lasted exactly 3 seconds. Jesus, Natalie. Are you okay? Do you need me to come over? I'm fine. I need information. How fast can your team work? Give me 2 hours. While Derek coordinated our investigation team, I began my own systematic analysis of Vincent's deception. I started with his laptop. The old tablet he'd left behind was still logged into several of his personal accounts. What I found there made my blood run cold. Vincent's browser history revealed months of careful research that painted a picture of premeditated fraud. He'd been visiting financial planning websites, researching offshore banking procedures, and reading articles about asset protection strategies. More chillingly, he'd spent considerable time on forums discussing marriage fraud, prenuptial agreement loopholes, and community property laws in Washington state. One bookmark particularly caught my attention: how to access spouses' financial information legally. The article detailed exactly how married couples could obtain account information, authorization procedures, and the legal protections available to spouses managing joint finances. Vincent had studied this like a textbook, his email account revealed. Even more damaging evidence. I found correspondence with 3 different banks about opening new accounts, all using our home address but only his name on the signature cards. He'd established a complete financial infrastructure for his escape plan, including a safety deposit box at Meridian Trust Bank that I'd never known existed. The most shocking discovery was a draft email in his saved folder, apparently intended for someone named Marcus but never sent. Everything is in place for Thursday. The consulting story worked perfectly. She never suspected I was tracking her real income sources. Found additional accounts beyond what we initially discussed. Take should be close to $900,000 total, much better than the $200,000 we originally projected. Flight confirmed for 6:15 p.m. Nassau connection. Will contact you once I'm established. Marcus. I recognize that name from my own past, Marcus Hendricks, the investment banker who tried to exploit my wealth 2 years earlier. Apparently, Vincent's betrayal wasn't just personal greed, it was a coordinated effort involving someone who already knew my real identity. My phone rang at exactly 8:47 p.m. Derek's name appeared on the screen. Natalie, you need to sit down for this. I'm already sitting. What did you find? Vincent Carmichael isn't his real name. His legal name is Vincent Marcus Chin Carmichael. He changed it legally 14 months ago, right around the time he would have been getting serious about your relationship. The room seemed to tilt slightly. What else? He's been married before. Twice. Both marriages ended with wives reporting financial fraud, but neither case was prosecuted because the wives chose not to pursue charges. We found sealed divorce records from Oregon and California. Derek's voice continued with methodical precision. His employment history is fabricated. Creative Dynamics confirmed he works there, but he started the job only 6 months ago, not the 18 months he told you. Before that, there's a gap in his employment history that coincides with his second divorce proceedings. Keep going. The offshore accounts where your money was transferred? They're not just random Bahamian banks. They're part of a sophisticated money laundering network that's been flagged by Treasury for suspicious activity. Vincent, or whoever he's working with, has done this before. I closed my eyes, absorbing the magnitude of Vincent's deception. Our entire relationship had been a fabrication from the beginning. He'd researched me, changed his identity, manufactured a believable background, and executed a long-term fraud scheme with professional precision. There's more, Derek continued. We traced the Marcus connection. Marcus Hendricks has been under federal investigation for investment fraud for 8 months. The FBI has been building a case around a scheme where he identifies wealthy women, usually through social engineering or data breaches, then coordinates with accomplices to develop relationships and systematically steal their assets. So Vincent was working for Marcus from the beginning? It appears so. We found financial records showing regular payments from Hendricks Investments to an account controlled by Vincent, dating back 16 months. He was being paid to target you specifically. The betrayal felt different now, more clinical, less personal, but somehow more enraging. Vincent hadn't fallen out of love with me or gotten greedy about our modest lifestyle. He'd never loved me at all. I'd been a mark, a target, a financial opportunity that he'd been paid to exploit. What about the money? I asked. That's where it gets interesting. The transfers went through, but they're sitting in holding accounts pending international clearance procedures. Bahamian banking regulations require a 72-hour review period for large international transfers, especially ones flagged by U.S. Treasury monitoring systems. The money is frozen until Saturday morning. For the first time since reading Vincent's note, I smiled. How long to get a complete dossier on Vincent's real identity, his associates, and his location? Already working on it. Our security consultant has contacts in Nassau who can provide real-time surveillance. We should have his exact location within 12 hours. Perfect. And Derek? I want a complete forensic accounting of every penny he Stole every account he touched, every transaction he made. I want documentation that would satisfy a federal prosecutor. Consider it done. But Natalie, are you planning to go to the FBI with this? I looked around my apartment, at the life Vincent had systematically dismantled, at the evidence of months of calculated deception spread across my desk. Going to the FBI would mean revealing my true identity, exposing Payflow Solutions to media attention, and potentially compromising the anonymity I'd worked so hard to maintain, but Vincent had made one crucial error in his research. He'd assumed that Natalie Rivera, the modest consultant, would be devastated and helpless when robbed of her life savings. He'd never considered the possibility that Natalie Rivera, CEO of Payflow Solutions, would have the resources to hunt him down and destroy him. Not yet, I told Derek. First, I'm going to get my money back. Then I'm going to make sure Vincent never targets another woman again. The FBI can have what's left of him when I'm finished. The next 12 hours were a masterclass in corporate level investigation. By Friday morning, I had Vincent's passport information, his hotel registration in Nassau, photographs of him checking into the Atlantis Paradise Island Resort, and copies of every financial transaction he'd made since landing in the Bahamas. More importantly, I had his exact location, his daily routine, and a detailed plan for ensuring that his tropical vacation would become the worst mistake of his criminal career. Vincent thought he'd disappeared with my life savings to a place where I couldn't touch him. What he didn't realize was that Payflow Solutions had business relationships with banks on 6 continents, including 3 major financial institutions in Nassau. It was time to teach my husband that he'd stolen from the wrong woman. Saturday morning found me sitting in the first-class cabin of a direct flight to Nassau, wearing a tailored business suit that cost more than Vincent's monthly salary and carrying a briefcase that contained enough legal documentation to end his freedom permanently. For the first time in 2 years, I wasn't hiding who I was. I was Natalie Rivera, CEO of Payflow Solutions, and I was about to remind my husband exactly who he'd chosen to rob. The transformation had been deliberate and strategic. I'd spent Friday evening shopping for clothes that reflected my actual status rather than the modest consultant persona I'd maintained. The navy Armani suit, the Italian leather shoes, the Cartier watch that had been sitting in my safe deposit box for months. Every detail was chosen to communicate power and wealth in a language that Vincent would understand immediately. Derek had coordinated everything with military precision. By the time my plane touched down at Lyndon Pindling International Airport, I had a rental car waiting, a suite reserved at the Ritz-Carlton, and a meeting scheduled with the senior management team at Nassau International Bank, where Vincent's stolen money was currently frozen in compliance review. Ms. Rivera, Thomas Blackstone, the bank's chief financial officer, greeted me in his corner office overlooking Paradise Harbor. We received your documentation this morning. This is quite an unusual situation. Unusual but not unprecedented, I replied, setting my briefcase on his conference table. Payflow Solutions handles financial fraud cases regularly. What makes this personal is that the perpetrator is my husband. Blackstone reviewed the forensic evidence Derek's team had compiled: bank records, transaction histories, communication logs, and most importantly, the proof that Vincent's transfers violated both U.S. anti-money laundering laws and Bahamian financial regulations. The funds are definitely frozen pending investigation, Blackstone confirmed. Your husband has been calling our customer service line hourly since Thursday, becoming increasingly agitated about the delay. He's threatened legal action, claimed the funds are for a legitimate business investment, and demanded to speak with senior management. Where is he staying? The Atlantis, Paradise Island presidential suite. He's been living quite extravagantly since his arrival, charging thousands to his room daily. Restaurant bills, spa treatments, shopping excursions. Yesterday he bought a Rolex Submariner from our hotel jewelry store for $8,400. The irony was breathtaking. Vincent was spending my stolen money on luxury items while waiting for access to my stolen money, completely oblivious to the fact that both sources would soon disappear. "I'd like to arrange a meeting," I said. "Can your bank facilitate a conference where Mr. Carmichael believes he's coming to resolve his account access issues?" Blackstone smiled grimly. "That can be arranged." 3 hours later, I was sitting in Nassau International Bank's executive conference room when Vincent walked through the door, and the look on his face was everything I'd hoped for and more. He'd dressed for the meeting in expensive resort wear, designer linen pants, a silk shirt, and the new Rolex gleaming on his wrist. His hair was perfectly styled, his tan already developing from 2 days in the Caribbean sun. He looked like a man who believed he'd successfully executed the perfect crime and was living his best life on the proceeds. Then he saw me, the color drained from Vincent's face so completely that I thought he might faint. He stopped walking, his mouth opening and closing silently, staring at me like he'd seen a ghost. "Hello, Vincent," I said calmly. Or should I say Vincent Marcus Chin Carmichael? "I understand you've been having some difficulties accessing your account." "Natalie?" His voice cracked on my name. "What? How are you here? How did you find me? Please, sit down." I gestured to the chair across from me. "Mr. Blackstone and I have been having a fascinating conversation about your recent financial activities." Vincent remained frozen in the doorway, his eyes darting between me and the bank official as if trying to process what was happening. I said, "Sit down." This time my voice carried the authority I used in board meetings when dealing with difficult investors. Vincent moved mechanically to the chair, his expensive clothes suddenly looking like a costume he was wearing to play a role he didn't understand. "Let me explain what's going to happen," I continued, opening my briefcase and removing a stack of documents. "First, you're going to listen while I tell you exactly who you stole from. Then you're going to sign these papers returning every penny you took. Finally, you're going to pray that I decide not to have you arrested." "I don't understand," Vincent stammered. "You're a consultant. You do payment processing for small businesses." The money in our accounts was my pocket change," I interrupted. "My name is Natalie Rivera, and I'm the founder and CEO of Payflow Solutions, a financial technology company valued at $47 million. We process $2.8 billion in transactions annually for over 200,000 clients worldwide." I slid a folder across the table containing press releases, financial reports, and business magazine covers featuring Payflow Solutions. "The $847,000 you stole represents approximately 3% of my liquid assets and less than 1% of my total net worth. You destroyed our marriage to steal what amounts to my monthly expense account." Vincent's hands were shaking as he opened the folder. I watched him scan the documents, his face cycling through disbelief, recognition, and finally, pure terror. "This is impossible," he whispered. "You live in a modest apartment. You drive a Honda. You clip coupons." "I lived modestly because I wanted to find someone who would love me for who I am, not what I'm worth. I thought I'd found that person in you. Instead, I found a professional con artist who'd been hired to target me specifically." Vincent's head snapped up. "Hired? I don't know what you're talking about." I removed another document from my briefcase, the draft email I'd found on his tablet. "Your correspondence with Marcus Hendricks suggests otherwise. 16 months of payments from Hendricks Investments, coordination with a known federal fraud investigation target, and a systematic plan to steal assets from wealthy women. You weren't just robbing me, Vincent. You were running a criminal enterprise. You went through my computer? His voice was barely audible. I went through everything. Your real identity, your criminal history, your previous marriages, your fake employment history, your offshore banking relationships. Did you really think someone who built a multi-million-dollar fintech company wouldn't have the resources to investigate financial fraud? Blackstone cleared his throat. Mr. Carmichael, or Mr. Chin Carmichael, I should inform you that your account has been flagged by both U.S. Treasury and Bahamian financial authorities. The funds in question have been frozen pending investigation of money laundering violations. Money laundering? Vincent's voice was rising toward panic. I didn't launder money. I just transferred funds from joint accounts that I legally had access to. Joint accounts funded by income you believed came from small business consulting, I said. Except the actual source of those funds was a major corporation with extensive anti-fraud monitoring systems. Every transaction you made has been tracked, recorded, and analyzed by some of the best financial investigators in the world. I opened my phone and showed Vincent a series of photographs, images of him at the Atlantis Hotel, receipts from his shopping excursions, transaction records from every purchase he'd made since arriving in Nassau. We know where you've been every minute since you landed. We know what you've spent, where you've eaten, what you've bought. We have more comprehensive surveillance data on you than the FBI has on most federal fugitives. Vincent slumped in his chair, the Rolex on his wrist catching the afternoon sunlight streaming through the conference room windows. What do you want? He asked finally. I want you to understand exactly how badly you miscalculated, I replied. You thought you were stealing from a helpless woman who would be devastated and powerless after losing her life savings. Instead, you stole from someone with the resources to hunt you down, freeze your assets, and destroy your life in ways you can't even imagine. I slid a final document across the table, a comprehensive legal agreement prepared by Payflow Solutions. Attorneys. You're going to sign this document, which authorizes the immediate return of all stolen funds to my accounts. You're going to surrender the Rolex, the jewelry, and anything else you've purchased with my money. You're going to check out of your hotel and fly back to Seattle tonight. And if I don't? I smiled for the first time since entering the conference room. Then I call the FBI, who are very interested in speaking with you about your association with Marcus Hendricks and his federal fraud investigation. I also call the media and explain how my company's fraud detection systems caught a marriage scammer in real time. You become a cautionary tale that destroys any chance you have of victimizing other women. Vincent stared at the document, his hands still trembling. Or, I continued, you sign the papers, return my money, and disappear quietly. You'll still face criminal charges eventually. The FBI doesn't ignore federal fraud cases, but you might avoid becoming a public example of what happens when someone steals from the wrong woman. Vincent reached for the pen with shaking fingers. One more thing, I said as he began signing. The modest consultant you thought you married? She never existed. The woman you're looking at right now, this is who I really am. This is who you chose to betray. As Vincent's signature completed the document, I realized that the past 6 months hadn't been about hiding my wealth to protect our relationship. They'd been about hiding my power until I needed to use it. 6 months later, I was sitting in my real office for the first time in 2 years, the corner suite on the 42nd floor of the Columbia Tower in downtown Seattle, overlooking Elliott Bay through floor-to-ceiling windows that had cost more than Vincent's annual salary. The morning Seattle Times lay open on my mahogany desk, featuring a front-page article with the headline, "Federal Fraud Ring Dismantled, Tech CEO's Personal Investigation Leads to Major Arrests." The irony wasn't lost on me. Vincent's betrayal, which was supposed to destroy my life, had instead become the catalyst for the most significant criminal justice breakthrough in financial fraud cases in over a decade, Special Agent Rebecca Morrison from the FBI's Financial Crimes Division was seated across from my desk, reviewing the final case documentation that would close the investigation into what the media had dubbed the marriage fraud network. "Your evidence was instrumental in bringing down the entire operation," Agent Morrison said, closing the thick file folder. "Without your forensic analysis and surveillance data, we never would have connected all the victims or traced the full scope of Hendrick's operation." The numbers were staggering. Marcus Hendricks had been running his marriage fraud scheme for over 4 years, targeting 18 women across 7 states. His network of accomplices, including Vincent, had stolen a combined total of $14 million from women who thought they were building relationships with men who loved them. Vincent's cooperation was particularly valuable, Agent Morrison continued. His testimony helped us understand the recruitment process, the targeting methodology, and the offshore banking relationships that made the operation possible. Vincent's cooperation had been the direct result of the choice I'd given him in that Nassau conference room. Face federal charges as a target of the investigation, or face federal charges as a cooperating witness. He'd chosen cooperation, though. I suspected his decision had more to do with fear than genuine remorse. "What's his sentence looking like?" I asked, though I'd already heard rumors through my legal team. 18 months federal prison, 5 years probation, full restitution to all victims, and permanent prohibition from accessing or managing other people's financial accounts. His cooperation agreement reduced what could have been a 7-year sentence. 18 months felt inadequate for destroying 2 years of my life, but I'd learned that justice wasn't always about punishment matching the crime. Sometimes justice was about ensuring the crime could never happen again. The real victory was systemic. Payflow Solutions had developed new fraud detection algorithms based on the patterns we'd identified in Vincent's operation. We'd created early warning systems that could identify suspicious relationship-based financial patterns and alert potential victims before significant damage occurred. 3 other fintech companies had licensed our technology, creating a network of protection that would prevent thousands of future victims. "There's something else," Agent Morrison said, her tone shifting to something more personal. "Vincent asked if he could send you a letter. We've reviewed it for any potential manipulation or attempts to re-establish contact. It appears to be a genuine apology." I looked at the sealed envelope she placed on my desk. Vincent's familiar handwriting spelled out my name, my real name this time, not the false identity he pretended to love. "You don't have to read it," Agent Morrison continued. "Many victims find that contact from perpetrators, even apologetic contact, can be re-traumatizing." "I'll consider it," I said, sliding the letter into my desk drawer without opening it. I wasn't ready to hear Vincent's version of remorse, but I also wasn't ready to destroy it unread. Agent Morrison gathered her files and stood to leave. "Ms. Rivera, I want you to know that your response to this crime was extraordinary. Most victims of sophisticated fraud feel powerless, violated, and ashamed. You turned your victimization into a tool for protecting others. That takes remarkable strength." After she left, I stood at my office windows, looking out at the city where I'd built my company and where Vincent had tried to destroy my life. The Seattle skyline looked different now, not because anything had changed, but because I was seeing it clearly for the first time in years. For the past 6 months, I'd been living authentically in ways I'd forgotten were possible. I'd moved into the penthouse apartment I'd been secretly maintaining, started driving the Tesla that had been gathering dust in my private garage, and begun wearing clothes that reflected my actual status rather than a carefully constructed persona. More importantly, I'd started building relationships based on truth rather than deception. My friendship with Derek had deepened into something genuine and supportive, built on shared professional respect and personal trust. I'd begun dating again, cautiously, but honestly, with men who knew exactly who I was and what I'd accomplished before our first conversation. The media attention that followed the federal arrests had been intense but manageable. Rather than hiding from publicity, I'd embraced it strategically, using interviews and speaking engagements to educate other women about relationship fraud warning signs. I'd appeared on financial news programs, testified before congressional committees about fintech security, and been featured on magazine covers as an example of entrepreneurial resilience. The woman Vincent had thought he was marrying, quiet, modest, financially dependent, had never really existed. She'd been a character I'd created to protect myself from exactly the kind of exploitation Vincent represented. In trying to destroy that fictional woman, Vincent had forced me to become someone stronger and more authentic than I'd ever been. My phone buzzed with a text from my assistant. "Your 2 p.m. is here." Dr. Patricia Valdez from the Financial Abuse Prevention Foundation. Dr. Valdez was a researcher studying the psychological impact of financial betrayal in intimate relationships. Our conversation was part of a broader initiative I'd funded to develop better support systems for fraud victims and create educational resources for recognizing financial manipulation. "Ms. Rivera," Dr. Valdez said as she entered my office, "thank you for making time. Your case has become a significant data point in our research, not just because of the amount stolen, but because of your response pattern." Response pattern? Most victims of intimate partner financial fraud experience long-term trauma, depression, and a reluctance to enter new relationships. Your case demonstrates that victims with significant personal resources and strong professional identities can transform the experience into positive action. You've become a case study in resilience. We spent an hour discussing the psychological mechanisms that had allowed me to recover so completely. Dr. Valdez was particularly interested in how my hidden identity had actually protected my core sense of self during Vincent's betrayal. "You weren't really in love with Vincent," she observed. "You were in love with the idea of being loved for who you thought you were. When that illusion was destroyed, your real identity remained intact." She was right. Vincent had never actually known me well enough to wound my authentic self. He'd attacked a persona I'd created, not the person I actually was. As Dr. Valdez packed up her notes, she asked a question that I'd been avoiding. "Do you think you'll ever trust someone enough to be vulnerable again?" I considered the letter from Vincent sitting in my desk drawer, unread. I thought about the careful walls I'd built around my wealth and identity, walls that had protected me from Vincent's exploitation but had also prevented authentic intimacy. "I'm learning that vulnerability doesn't mean hiding who you are," I said finally. "Real vulnerability means being completely honest about your strength, your success, and your worth, then trusting someone to love you not despite those things, but because of them." That evening, I finally opened Vincent's letter. It was 3 pages of handwritten apology, genuine remorse, and detailed explanation of how Marcus Hendricks had recruited him by promising easy money for relationship consulting. Vincent described the months of preparation, the psychological manipulation tactics he'd been trained to use, and his growing guilt as our relationship had developed beyond his original assignment. The final paragraph stayed with me. I know you'll never forgive me, and I don't deserve forgiveness. But I want you to know that somewhere in the middle of lying to you about everything else, I actually did fall in love with you. Not with your money, I didn't know about that then, but with your kindness, your intelligence, and your genuine interest in my dreams. That love was the only real thing in our entire relationship, and it made what I did to you even more unforgivable. I hope someday you find someone who deserves the love you're capable of giving. I folded the letter and put it back in my desk drawer. Vincent's belated honesty didn't change what he'd done, but it confirmed something important: the woman he'd fallen in love with was real. She wasn't the modest consultant persona I'd created, she was me, the ambitious CEO who'd been hiding her light to make others comfortable. A year later, Payflow Solutions was valued at $87 million. I'd been featured on the cover of Forbes as one of the most influential women in fintech. The fraud prevention technology we developed had protected over 50,000 potential victims from relationship-based financial crimes, and I'd stopped hiding who I was. The right person wouldn't be intimidated by my success or threatened by my wealth. They'd be excited to build something amazing together, knowing exactly who they were choosing to love. Vincent's biggest mistake hadn't been underestimating my wealth, it had been underestimating my worth. The difference between those two things was everything. Coming up next, you'll see 2 more stories we handpicked just for you. If this one struck a chord, you're going to love what's next. Tap to keep the journey going.